Hello and welcome to Chapter 27, Section 3, Europeans Claim Muslim Lands. So the same European powers that carved up Africa also were not satisfied with Africa and looked to other areas of the world to find new areas that they could claim. And the Muslim lands that were around the Mediterranean were already mostly claimed by the conquests of the Arab and the Ottoman Empire. At its peak, the Ottoman Empire was one of the largest empires in the world. However, over the last 300 years, it steadily declined in power, and around this time, the Europeans began to turn their eyes to these lands in hopes of gaining them for themselves. The Ottoman Empire was struggling to fit into the modern world. They had made many attempts to change and modernize, but they were unable to do so quickly enough to stop the advancement of the European powers. The last great sultan of the empire was Suleiman I, and he died in 1566 and was followed by multiple weak sultans who were unable to control the vast empire that the Ottoman Empire covered. The government broke apart into a number of factions, and financial losses were also common due to the corruption of the court. They also lagged behind in adopting some of the modern technologies that their European equals had also adopted. In 1789, Selim III came to power and attempted to modernize his army. However, there was resistance among his ranks that caused the progress to be slow. And not long after this, he was overthrown and his reforms were abandoned. During this period, there also were a lot of nationalist movements and feelings that began to stir up among the people in the empire. Around 1830, Greece gained their independence, and Serbia gained self-rule not long after that. And these were the first cracks in the Ottoman Empire that were forming. It soon became clear to the Europeans that the empire was weak, and they began to look for ways that they could take land from the Ottomans. At this point, let's discuss the concept of geopolitics. Geopolitics are an interest in or taking of land for its strategic location or its products. And this concept played a significant role in the fate of the Ottoman Empire. The empire was located strategically around the Mediterranean, which made these lands very attractive to foreign powers. This location allowed the Ottomans to control the access points to the Mediterranean and Atlantic Sea trade. Merchants in landlocked countries that were beyond the Black Sea had to pass through the Ottoman lands in order to get to water. Russia, for example, desperately wanted a seaport that would allow them to pass their grain products into the Mediterranean, and from there take them anywhere they wished to go. This desire led to aggression on the part of the Russians towards the weakening Ottoman Empire, and this led to an eventual declaration of war upon the Ottomans by the Russians. Oil was also soon discovered in Persia around 1900 in the Arabian Peninsula after World War I. This led to an even greater interest in the area. As generation after generation of Russian czars came into power, each continued to battle the Ottomans for territory on the banks of the Black Sea. And again, Russia was in search of a warm water port there. In 1853, war broke out between the Russians and the Ottomans, and we call this war the Crimean War. It's named that because the peninsula that most of the war was fought on is called the Crimean Peninsula. Eventually, Britain and France intervened in this conflict because they wished to limit the aggression of the Russians toward the Ottomans. This led them to ally themselves with the Ottomans, and these three countries worked together and defeated the Russians. This war was unique because it was the first war in which women served as nurses. The most famous of these nurses during this war was Florence Nightingale, which you may have heard of. And this was also the first war in which war correspondents were present and writing for their newspapers on the events of the war for the general public's information. Prior to this, obviously, the general public knew that war was going on, but they didn't know the big picture. And so this is the first time that they were able to gain some of that information. This war also made it very clear that the Ottomans' military was very weak. And even with the help of the British and the French, they continued to lose land. When the Slavic people in the Balkans rebelled in pursuit of their freedom, they were aided by the Russians and were successful. The Ottomans lost control of Romania, Montenegro, Cyprus, Bosnia, and Herzegovina, and the region that is present-day Bulgaria. They lost land in Africa as well. And we even have a term now for the process of a larger area fragmenting into smaller ethnic countries that's named after this process, which we call balkanization. At the beginning of World War I, the Ottoman Empire was significantly smaller and it was in serious, serious trouble. For much of the 19th century, Russia and Britain engaged in another geopolitical struggle. This time it was over the Muslim lands that were in Central Asia. We call this period the Great Game, and it consisted mostly over the battle for India specifically. India at this time was one of Britain's most profitable colonies. The Russians sought to expand and wished to gain the riches of India for themselves. Britain defended their colony and even wanted to expand its borders, and their struggle was centered on the territory between their borders, the area of Afghanistan. In this period, Afghanistan was an independent Muslim kingdom, and the rough terrain and the toughness of the people that lived there was continually frustrating for the European powers because they wanted to gain these lands but were unable to. For decades, the Afghans fought the British off, and in 1881, the British finally withdrew from the area and formally agreed to stay out of the area in 1921. The new Soviet Union, which was formerly Russia, they've now changed their name, also signed a non-aggression pact with Afghanistan, and this agreement was honored until as late as 1979, when the Soviet Union invaded Afghanistan. So as the Ottoman Empire fell in power and prestige, the other Muslim empires looked on and did not wish to end up like them. And so this led their leaders to decide that they must modernize or risk losing their territories and lands. So when the French began to show interest in Egypt, their leaders were forced to modernize. The French were interested in the Egyptian lands due to their strategic location at the head of the Red Sea. Napoleon sought to claim these lands and failed, and from his failure, a new leader arose. We know him as Muhammad Ali. Now, this is obviously not the American boxer. This man was a common soldier who was able to rise through the ranks of the Egyptian army due to his skill as a military leader and his political shrewdness. He started out as a member of an expeditionary force to Egypt from the Ottoman Empire, but soon broke away from their control. He fought a series of battles that allowed him to take control of Syria and Arabia, and he was eventually able to establish a hereditary monarchy for his descendants. When his power was solidified, he began to reform his country. He personally directed a shift in the agriculture of Egypt to focus on plantation cash crops, specifically cotton. This period is where you can trace the concept of Egyptian cotton. And this brought Egypt into the international marketplace. This did have a negative influence upon the peasants of Egypt, though. Many of them lost the use of lands that they usually farmed for their own food, and they were forced to grow cash crops instead of their food for their families. These modernizations were continued by Muhammad Ali's grandson, Ismail, and he supported the creation of the Suez Canal. The Suez Canal was a man-made waterway that cut through the Isthmus of Suez. And you can see it actually pointed to on this map here, right over here. And this connected the Red Sea to the Mediterranean. And this was built mainly by using French money and through private interest groups, but using Egyptian labor. It opened in 1869, and there was a huge international celebration over its founding. However, this, plus many other innovations that were put into place, were very, very expensive. And soon the country of Egypt found themselves in a huge amount of debt. And so in order to settle these debts and maintain peace, the British involved themselves and insisted that they control the canal, which they were eventually able to do, and they assumed control of it in 1882. So now let's talk about Asia. In Southwest Asia, Russia and Britain competed to exploit the riches of Persia, and they both desired to bring it under their sphere of influence. Russia, again, was seeking that ever-elusive warm water port, this time trying to gain access to the Persian Gulf and the Indian Ocean. And after there were military defeats in 1813 and 1828, Persia ceded its lands to Russia. And Britain desired to use Afghanistan as a buffer between India and Russia because they didn't want the Russians getting too close to their lands in India. So Persia resisted and the British demands, but eventually were forced to give up all their claims to Afghanistan. So Britain became even more interested in Persia after oil was discovered there in 1908. Persia did not have the money to take the resources in their land and develop them so that they might make a profit and have progress. So, to raise money, the Persian ruler began to allow Western businesses to begin operating in certain areas or develop a certain product. An example of this was the Anglo-Persian Oil Company, which developed the rich oil fields as early as the 1900s. Several of these Persian rulers were very corrupt. They wished to sell concessions to the European rulers and let them come in and maintain these lands, where the people, and often the religious leaders, wished to limit the changes they saw and did not want a lot of Western involvement in their countries. And so this distrust and disagreement between the rulers and the people caused a lot of issues. Around this time, a ruler named Nasir al-Din sold a concession to a British company that would allow them to export Persian tobacco. This outraged another local ruler, Jamal al-Din al-Afghani, who was a leader who wished to have Persia modernized, and he wanted the Persians to be able to use the tobacco for their own riches. So he set up a tobacco boycott by the heavy smoking Persians. And the boycott worked. There were riots over the issue that broke out, and the ruler was forced to cancel the concession with the British. This unrest and competition between the rulers continued, and the government eventually lost control over the country. And in 1906, revolutionaries forced the ruler to establish a constitution in Persia. Then, in 1907, Russia and Britain moved in and they took over the country and divided it between themselves and assumed economic and complete control over the area known as Persia. So that's it. That's the end of section 3. It's a pretty short section, a lot of movement going on, but all of this is going to be really important to what we talk about in this chapter. So I hope you took good notes. Thanks. Have a great day.